Testing 1, 2, 3.
The things I do for YouTube, you know. Of course, my laptop is restarting right now. Really nice. Can't wait for that. I'm so happy. What's up, you guys? I've been making a lot of relationship videos lately, and don't get me wrong, I love making them as much as the next person, but I also want to make sure that I'm touching on other life things and just switching it up here on my channel. So today's topic is going to be about public speaking and the things that I learned from taking a very specific public speaking course back when I was in business school that I want to share with you guys because yes, this video is for people who are in school, are forced to give presentations once a month in front of classmates, but listen, let me be clear when I say that shit does not end when school ends. You will likely be giving presentations in some form when you waltz into that career life. Consider that your formal warning. Now, let me just touch on the fact that public speaking is my arch nemesis. It is literally the thing that I dread most in my day-to-day life. And honestly, going through business school really whipped me into shape with the realization that I'm not going to get away from it. And then just starting my career and getting into my job and realizing that I'm making just as many PowerPoint presentations and presenting probably 3 times the amount of times has really just presented this dark realization that presenting is my fate. Also, public speaking doesn't just have to be in a presentation. It can be pitching ideas in a meeting, speaking your mind, interjecting people when people get off track during brainstorm sessions, giving feedback, and so much more. So I really think that being able to be comfortable speaking in front of other people when they're staring at you is a really strong skill to have. Now, I get a lot of people being like, oh, Sam, you film YouTube videos. How can you hate public speaking? Listen, there's no one looking at me except for my own reflection right now, okay? There's not a single human in sight, okay? Looking, scanning, nobody. I can control what I say without looking in the eyes of another human, and I can edit what I'm saying. So this does not count as public speaking. Moving on. First things first are those filler words and gestures and small things that we might do to string together our words. Now, there's ones that are obvious like and like, but it's also really good to be aware of any mouth sounds that you may be making. That sounds so weird. Tongue clicks is a big one. And if you don't know what I mean by that, sometimes when people start a sentence, they kind of smack their tongue and make a tongue click sound. Let me try and recreate it for you. I hope that really caught on the mic, because if not, I don't know what to say, but it happens sometimes in my videos too, and I edit them out, but it's really good to be aware of if you're starting your sentence with a distracting sound that just puts this weird subconscious distraction in your audience's mind. Also, nobody wants to hear your saliva tongue sounds, okay? So cut those and practice and be aware of when you're making those sounds. Second thing, and this is probably something that I am not necessarily great at, but have had to learn, especially from taking that one class that I was talking about, but being very intentional with your movements. So when you're standing at the front of the room and you're giving your super motivational speech, presentation, whatever, you want to make sure that you're engaging with your audience, which you can do by intentional movements. So instead of just staying stagnant in the middle of the room, actually engage with your audience by walking around and really filling the space that you have at the front of the room. Now, walking around is one thing, but you also want to make sure that you're not being too distracting with your movements. And that's where the tough balancing act comes in. Let me tell you, how distracting would it be if the person that you're listening to is just pacing back and forth, taking really interesting steps and just constantly moving? What you want to do instead is making sure that your movements match what you're saying. Every time I make a point, maybe I will gesture and take one step in a certain direction, and then the next point I'll take another step. That way it feels like my motions, my gestures really match with what I'm saying and put emphasis on what I'm saying and add value to my presentation instead of being distracting. Same thing goes with hand gestures, and I'm a very hand gesture-y person, so bear with me as I'm not the best at this, but also making sure that when you're using your hands to speak, is it adding to what you're saying, or is it just, again, distracting? You don't want to be looking at someone who's constantly la 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 la, blah blah blah, 20-minute presentation, lick my hands, wow! You don't want that. Similar to what I said before, you want to make sure that your hand gestures match with what you're saying. So are you moving your hands to emphasize a point and making sure that they add or help visualize what you're saying and give life to your presentation, as opposed to being this Moving on. Eye contact, okay? I used to make this very common mistake where you're presenting to a group full of people and you're like, easy, I'll just look off into the far distance, make no eye contact with anyone, and it'll be totally fine because I'm talking to this large audience. No, that is how people get bored of what you're saying. It's not engaging, and people will notice that you're looking at no one, especially if it's a prolonged presentation where you're just standing in the middle of the room looking in one spot the entire time that you're giving this presentation. Again, you want to be intentional with your eye contact. You don't want to stare at one person the entire time because that will make them very uncomfortable, especially if you're like me and you have stage fright. I get stage fright from other people looking at me, even if I'm not the one presenting. It's like this whole thing. All right, let's not talk about it. But think about how you can engage with your audience members and make them feel like you're really talking to them without singling them out for the entire presentation. So what we were taught to do is to, again, match what you're doing and match your actions and match your eye contact with what you're saying. So for one point, I'll look at one person and make eye contact and tell them that point. And then when I move on to the next point, I'll look at a different person on the opposite side of the room. I'll move back, I'll move forward, I'll move side to side and make sure I'm really engaging with my audience and really driving home what I'm trying to say so that it really feels like I'm speaking to the people in front of me instead of at the people in front of me. Okay? Similarly, you want to create this dynamic experience of making sure that you're touching all points of the room. What often happens is we look at one spot, we stay in one spot, we use the same body language, same hand gestures, and we stay at the same volume. And what happens is your presentation and what you're saying becomes really stagnant instead of dynamic. So in terms of volume, how are you making sure that you're changing the loudness of what you're saying to emphasize certain points, the inflections that you're using, etc. So when you're driving home something really important, maybe you want to project your voice a little bit more and really push your point. And then when you're trying to tie it all together and explaining why that point is so important, lower your voice, make it a little bit more calm and be like, and that is why this. And when you start to create that dynamic experience, it's a lot more interesting to listen to. It really adds to your presentation and drives home that experience and that emphasis on all the things that you're trying to get your audience to engage with. And B, and C, it just adds to that power, that confidence, that intention that you're putting behind your words and behind your presentation. And then my final tip is to make sure that before a presentation, you're taking all these tips, you're taking what you want to say, and you are practicing until your throat bleeds. As someone who literally blacks out, like I kid you not, I will give a presentation, everything goes blank, sweating internally, and I physically am not there. Like I am just robotically giving my speech, and the only way that I can make sure that it goes well is I practice it so much. Honestly, I'm sure somebody who watches me practice would be able to give my presentation based on how many times I've repeated it. But making sure that you've trained your brain to just speak, to do all those things that I talked about, eye contact, gestures, volume levels, avoiding tongue clicks. If you have rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed, trust me, by the time you get to the front of the room, your brain will just exercise its muscle memory and your presentation will likely be so much more smooth. And I know that's an obvious thing, but I want to make sure that while you're memorizing, it's also important to really understand what you're talking about so that even when your brain farts, you know what you were saying, you can easily correct, and you can easily just jump right back in and speak to it as naturally as possible so it doesn't sound like a speech, if that makes sense. I find that with all of these things, I've gotten a lot of really good feedback at being good at public speaking. Yes, there are still times where I get really nervous, especially in new settings or times that I have to speak on the spot, but the more you practice these things and the more aware that you are of these things, the easier that it gets. Let me know if it helped you in the comments down below, and leave your suggestions on what you want to see next, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!